Today was Adaptation, Loss and Damage Day. Barack Obama was here today. He gave an hour-long speech during which he named and shamed China, Indonesia, Russia, and Brazil, not Saudi Arabia, which is interesting considering what everybody here is speaking about regarding their negotiating team's destructive work, and that is an apt word. However, as ever, there were political considerations that Barack Obama chose to give deference to. The energy of citizens and civil society has to be mustered to meet this challenge of climate change. That's why I'm so excited to have had a chance to speak to a real leader in civil society, Jamie Peters, a director at Friends of the Earth. But with that teaser, before we get there, I'd like to set out a brief summary of what loss and damage means, because UKLA listeners may not be familiar with that term, with that language. Loss and damage is effectively the impact of climate change that exceeds adaptation limits. The Alliance of Small Island States, AOSIS, first brought up the issue of loss and damage way back in 1991. That's even before the UNFCCC was drafted. And they proposed establishing an international insurance pool as a collective loss-sharing mechanism to compensate victims of projected sea level rise. And that's a very sensible suggestion. Unfortunately, it did not happen. However, matters aren't quite so simple. So, for example, it isn't a matter of just saying developed countries should pay, despite the moral force of that argument, because, and this was rightly pointed out by the Stockholm Environment Institute, by focusing a debate only on the risks that countries cannot avoid without external finance, risks creating perverse incentive to ignore local drivers of vulnerability. The issue hasn't been totally sidelined. The Paris Agreement does recognize in Article 8 that there is an importance of averting, minimizing, and addressing loss and damage from climate change. It encourages cooperation and facilitation to enhance understanding, action, and support on risk reduction and management. But lest anyone think that Article 8 forms the basis for some sort of compensation, that would be wrong. The COP decision which accompanied the Paris Agreement provided the requisite clarity for the states concerned about the risk of claims for compensation, and that's Article 51 of the COP decision, which says Article 8, and I quote, does not involve or provide a basis for any liability or compensation. So in the absence of a global system for pooling contributions to apportion compensation for loss or damage, or loss and damage due to climate change, does that mean the courts will be asked to tackle this question? The answer is yes. One case that I find absolutely fascinating is one we've already seen, the pending case of the Peruvian farmer who is suing the German utility RWE. This is known as the Juarez case. Here, Mr. Liua is suing RWE, seeking compensation for the cost of protecting his town in Peru from melting glaciers. The damages he seeks equates to only 0.47% of the costs. And that 0.7% has been the calculated contribution from the emissions that RWE has put into the global atmosphere. That case, as I understand it, has been granted permission in the German courts and is pending. So very much a case of watch that space for the outcome there. There is also legislation which covers this issue in a very interesting way. I'm thinking of Kenya's. The Kenyan Climate Change Act, dated from 2016, does facilitate lawsuits against carbon emitters by providing climate change duties on public and private entities. So Section 16, subsection 1, provides that the council may impose climate change obligations on private entities, including entities constituted under the Public Benefits Organisations Act. Subsection 2 says the council shall make regulations governing the nature and procedure for reporting on performance by private entities, including the authority to monitor and evaluate compliance. And I hear investors trying to compare and contrast what different companies globally are saying and doing under ESG strategies, saying amen to that. the Kenyan Act continues, subsection 3 of section 16. Notwithstanding other provisions in this Act, the Council may require a private entity subject to climate change obligations to, at any time, prepare reports on the status of its performance of the climate change duties and prescribe the period for reporting, and require any private entity that fails to comply with its climate change obligations to prepare a report within a specified time on the actions it has taken, is taking, or intends to take to secure future performance with those duties. By section 17, subsection 1a, the National Environmental Management Authority shall, and again, this is a mandatory provision, shall monitor, investigate, and report on whether public and private entities are in compliance with the assigned climate change duties, shall ascertain that private entities are in conformity with instructions prescribed under section 16, and regulate, enforce, and monitor compliance on levels of greenhouse gas emissions as set by the Council under this Act. And this is my favourite bit of this provision. There are criminal penalties with up to 5 years in prison for providing false information or, in the language of the statute, hindering the authority when exercising any of its functions under the Kenyan Climate Change Act. So very interesting legislation. That's just one example. Turning to the usual roundup of daily announcements, there were just over 70 endorsements for the principles for locally led adaptation, including over $450 million American dollars for initiatives and programs enhancing locally led approaches. Australia, New Zealand, Italy, and the African Development Bank have now joined the Champions Group on Adaptation Finance. Some $232 million, important word there, $232 million American dollars has now been committed to the Adaptation Fund. And that is about time, given the historic imbalance between mitigation and adaptation funding, something everybody was going into this COP hoping to see addressed. That $232 million includes a $20 million contribution from the UK, as well as commitments from the US, Canada, Sweden, Finland, Ireland, Germany, Norway, Qatar, Spain, Switzerland, and regional governments, including Quebec and Flanders. Some 88 countries are now covered by either adaptation communications or national adaptation plans. The latter are plans to increase preparedness for climate risks, and there is good pace in relation to the progression and publication of those. There are some 38 plans published just last year alone. Now, loss and damage was always going to be a difficult day. Everybody expected that. Summing up the mood, COP President Alok Sharma said loss and damage has historically been seen as a polarizing issue. No kidding. But he said he was encouraged that the mood music has changed somewhat. With those faint words of hope, here is my interview with the marvellous Jamie Peters. We are delighted to be joined by Jamie. Jamie, hello.
Hello, lovely to meet you. Nice to be here in Glasgow on second week of COP. Time flies.
Second week of COP, I think we're all feeling it right now. We've had one rest day, but we're already exhausted by the end of week one. So, Jamie, what's the key outcome that Friends of the Earth would like to see from this 2-week extravaganza?
So I think the important thing to remember, the purpose of these talks is to keep the world on track to be below 1.5 degree emissions rise, or temperature rise rather. So that's just really important to be reminded whenever we talk about any success or how the COP went. That's why we're here. That's what we're trying to do in accordance with the Paris Agreement. So we've seen a fairly chaotic first week. Had a lot of access and participation issues. The venue's small. People are comparing it to Copenhagen, saying that this has been a really tricky one. So we've had a lot of that, and that is very important. We've had civil society struggling to engage, and it's important to remember civil society, they're here, but they support delegations as well. They follow the talks. They're a really key part of making sure this process goes well, and there's 8 different constituencies. That's youth, Indigenous, NGOs. So we should be having a really important part to play in these talks. That's been a struggle. What we seen last week. What we are seeing in general is a bit of a transformation of the UNFCCC space, these UN climate talks. We're just sort of seeing big grand announcements that aren't really tied to the talks itself, which we've seen the first 2 days where world leaders jetted in. And I think from my view, they slightly set the stage somewhat cynically, but when they flew out on Tuesday, the hard work was done because they had the big announcement on methane. They were going to reduce it 30% by 2030, but actually didn't include the number 1 and 2 methane emitters in the world. Yeah, the following day, I think it was Ireland said, well, their reduction target will only be 10% actually because it was a global target. So, this is a methane announcement. We also had one on deforestation and one of fossil fuel phase outs. Now, we're always the negative ones a little bit, but it's the right direction, but it's not enough. It's too slow. So this week, I feel like, again, the stage has been set for a big push to say it's been a success. But again, like I said at the start, this should be a legal process. The things that we had last week were outside of it, not as binding. And when we dug into them, they were just sort of sexy headlines. And that allows countries to hide behind the headlines, but hide behind each other as well. So we'll be pushing for, what's the test of this COP being successful? Is it going to keep us below 1.5? And we already know the warming at 1.1 now is disastrous for countries. £26 billion, Germany are saying they'd have to pay for the floods, as well as global south countries who've been living with these impacts for a long time already. And in addition, we know there will be a gap between what countries say they're trying to do in terms of their pledges and 1.5. So it's really important that that's recognised, and they set a date as soon as possible to have a summit to say, well, how do we bridge that gap? And then the second thing, in terms of success from our point of view, and I don't think it will be a success, is beyond the emissions gap, what about the finance? There's countries that are, it's a collective problem, but some countries have contributed more to this than others. It's the global north, countries like ourselves. So the finance aspect is massive here. They've failed to live up to their promises of 100 billion each year. They're below that. And if we're really wanting to support the developing world, to get to clean energy, they need finance. And that's before we even mention loss and damage finance, which has become a big part of the talks. So to be honest, those criteria won't be met. And it's really important that we don't talk about what's politically feasible or our baseline of being better than we thought, but is this what we need? Like, we've all seen just how urgent the problem is. So from Friends of Earth's point of view, that's what we'd say. Finances are there, the emission pledge is there. And as I said, this access and participation has to get better. And the UK's not done a good job on it so far.
So set the ambition correctly and put in place the mechanisms to get it done. And I want to turn to enforcement and how Friends of the Earth is going to hold leaders accountable to the pledges that they've made here, because of course that's how we get the change that we need. But speaking of loss and damage, and Jamie, you're far more knowledgeable than I am about this, but from what I understand, loss and damage is a hugely important issue, very, very controversial, and it's effectively, again, from what I understand, after mitigation, after adaptation, there is, it's a innocuous term, but it signifies a huge issue, residual impacts, which is what's left over, the damage that countries suffer, and generally in the global south, the developing nations, when the impacts of climate change go beyond what we can adapt to right now. So the flooding and the physical damage that they're enduring right now, from what I understand, that constitutes loss and damage. And there are discussions over, just as you said, they are the people suffering it, the countries suffering it are generally not the ones who have caused it. And are you aware of where those discussions are going? They need to be had, but it seems they don't really, they're had, everyone walks away frustrated, and no resolution is actually achieved. Is that what's going on here, or is there progress being made there?
So, your description of it's exactly right there. That's what loss and damage is. We've already seen a huge amount of climate violence that these countries are going through already. They've had loss and damage is a good name. That's exactly what it is. So this is talking about recognising the fact this happened. And this is why many of us are engaged in climate change, right? Because the countries suffering the most, the least responsible. It's the ultimate injustice. So that's why this loss and damage is a big part of the talks. Speaking to the delegations from the Global South, they are frustrated at the lack of progress. The G77 are not happy. The developed world, the global north, they've not met the sort of meagre financial obligations so far when it's come to mitigation and adaptation. And surprisingly, they're not super keen to put loads into loss and damage either. So it is
Didn't America put in a clause in the Paris Declaration that loss and damage doesn't actually mean we're going to pay compensation to you, notwithstanding Article 8 of the Paris Agreement?
Yeah, the USA have been absolutely deplorable in these talks for years. That's why it was somewhat jarring to see President Obama speak yesterday about his message of hope for young people, as if he'd not had anything to do with the USA's awful negotiating position. I'll try not to be too cynical. It's week 2.
Sure, we've got 4 more days. Well, 3 more days, Jamie.
So that fight is still going ahead. I think it is a red line for many global south countries, quite rightly. We've seen really meagre contributions to it this week. I think the Scottish Government were one of the first to talk about funding, but it was £1 million.
Right.
I mean, it's a bit of a political move, I think, rather than anything. So this needs scaled up massively. It's getting a lot of attention in the talks, and that's important. It's getting reported on.
A dedicated day to it.
So that move, which is a positive thing, I think the literacy around this is high now in climate change in general. When we did media interviews at the start of the year, don't use the word COP, we were told, but now everyone knows what COP is. So we're aware of it, and things like loss and damage now do have more prominence. I don't think anyone's going to be particularly happy with where we get to for loss and damage, but again, it's frustrating as it can be at these talks. It's COP26, right? There's 26 one, there'll be 27, there'll be 28. It's a moment that we go through. Glasgow, despite the hype, it's not now or never. They're going to go on. Climate struggle is not a now or never one. It's one that's going to outlast my generation. It's something we're constantly going to be fighting against because every point of a degree matters. So whilst Glasgow is so important, we need the pressure there. I think the loss and damage discussion will rumble on.
Okay, and now I'm not going to let you off the topic of difficult situations, Jamie. How about accountability and ensuring that there's some sort of enforcement mechanism for what's being said will be done here? How is Friends of the Earth and civil society generally going to play a role in that?
So I think, in theory, that's the strength of the UNFCCC process, right? There is a level of accountability, and there's a flawed process. We know this can be a frustrating one for any of us who've been engaged in it, but at least in theory, it allows that level of accountability to be there. I think we're a little bit worried we're seeing that untangle with mainly, the global north countries trying to have these sort of side announcements or things that are outside the process itself. So we want to sort of make sure things are in the text, in the official agreements, in the cover notes, because that does allow, in theory, it allows the Maldives to speak as an equal to other countries. We know the reality is that the dirty tricks go on in terms of aid budgets, in terms of don't speak out. The majority of the countries here, G77 obviously represents a lot more than 77 countries, or maybe not obviously, it's G77, it should be 77, but it does. So there's a lot of other geopolitics going on, so it's important that UNFCCC remains like an arena and we abide by the rules for it. However, the second aspect for that is how we as Friends of the Earth, as a group in England, Wales, Northern Ireland, or Friends of the Earth is an international federation, we have different international groups, how we use this process and the things said here when we go to our domestic campaigns. So domestically, in the UK here, there is a separate Friends of the Earth Scotland, and they'll do similar. If what Boris Johnson's saying, if what Nicola Sturgeon is saying should be taken at face value, that means, okay, the 40 fossil fuel projects that the UK has in the pipeline just now, they don't get off the ground if there's a climate compatibility check. That includes a coal mine in Cumbria. It's 2021. Boris Johnson did his big words around coal. We still have a coal mine in Cumbria, potentially. And it includes Campbell, which is an oil and gas field off Shetland Isles. These could be potentially new proposals that we're fighting over. It's absurd that we are. So that's how we use that accountability as well in terms of public perception, making that just, there is no there's less and less of a social license for fossil fuel projects now. We've seen this for things like fracking, which were thrown out because communities rose up against it and said they were not going to stand for it. And I think we've all seen such a sea change of public attitudes when it comes to climate change in the past 2 or 3 years. I got involved in climate through youth activism. That's where I used to come through COPs. I'm 36 now, so it was a while ago. But
You'd never know it.
if we tried to arrange a youth march though back in the day, and speaking to a friend last night, we'd had not many people on it. The one in Glasgow we seen had thousands of people on it, and then we did that 2 days. They did that 2 days in a row. So the public have changed. 2/3 of Britons want UK to be a climate leader. We've seen a massive, massive shift across the country. People get it. Governments are feeling the pressure. And climate's there's no longer a debate. We're seeing political parties trying to say how much greener they are than the other one, or much more sustainable. So in terms of accountability, it's not just about the sort of arcane process of UNFCCC, it's the big words. Okay, what does it mean? It means you have to invest in renewable energy, it means you stop funding for fossil fuels. In the UK, again, going back to these announcements, they're still looking to fund over £1 billion worth of funding, a mega gas project in Mozambique, something Friends of the Earth are taking them to court over. So it means, okay, all these things get stopped. That's what accountability is. You can be a climate leader, which you're going to hear on Friday. UK will claim to be a climate leader. You can be a climate leader, or you can be for 40 fossil fuel projects, including Cumbria, Cambo, Mozambique, but you can't be both at the same time. So that's what Friends of the Earth will be saying when it comes to accountability.
Excellent. And now, just to end up with a summary position of how this has gone, I have to say I've come here as a total pessimist. I've worked in the UN in international development and been to Copenhagen. And if you'd asked me 3 years ago whether we were going to meet 1.5, I would have said absolutely not. So I'm actually pleasantly surprised with a rock bottom baseline of expectations. How do you feel about the outcome? And I appreciate we've got a few more days, but are you optimistic or are you pessimistic? What's your overview of the progress made here?
Well, I'm a dour Glaswegian, so I'm pessimistic anyway. But I think we'll probably see a few other announcements this week. I think they'll generally be welcomed. The devil will be in the detail. There'll be some issues around what is the phase out of fossil fuels. We're currently going through a fight around the language of fossil fuels within the cover notes or the big decisions. So that's absent just now. So we need to work to make sure that's there. There is a big push from countries to talk about anything other than stopping fossil fuel exploration. Right? They want to talk about net zero 2050. Phase outs when we run out of things. So I think the language and the urgency will not be enough. And again, the very first thing I said to you, is it enough to keep us to 1.5 or not? So that will be still the litmus test and still where we base it on. Things, and there's other views that people are saying things have went better than they've seen. There's been more progress than they expected. When we work with Friends of the Earth, we work with our international groups. So we try to take the lead from the countries who are feeling the sharp end of climate change already, and they're not widely celebrating or widely optimistic where things are. So that's what our line will be. And no matter what happens at COP, any COP I've been to, our message always the day after or the day it finishes is like, right, get to the work then. This is the hard work. They go back to your countries, make it happen. We'll continue to push the UK government on everything that we've been doing this year and going forward as a campaign and organisation. And I think bigger than that, it's not just about Friends of the Earth. The UK public will be demanding it as well. They're now seeing just how urgent things are and that they'll be holding people to account. So what comes out of COP, it's always important, but the message is always, okay, there's more to be done. And it's what happens in between the COPs that's really key, all these domestic policies.
Yeah, it's only 2 weeks of the year.
Exactly, it is. And there'll be another one, it's just a moment. So in terms of being optimistic or not, if we're looking for leadership and hope, I honestly don't look to the conference just over the river here. I look to the outside it, where we've seen massive marches across the world, across the country, and they're getting bigger and bigger. The resistance against fossil fuels is getting bigger and bigger. It's been led by diverse communities, and they've shifted politicians on. It's not the other way around. Politicians haven't changed communities to get into this. So in terms of hope and optimism, look at the hope. We see sort of people marching on the streets, the amazing youth climate movement. Like, it's just people, the young, sounds good, the kids will say this, but the young generation, they really get it. And there's been a massive, even within the movement, the language of climate justice has become so prominent. Even world leaders are speaking about it. We're no longer talking about incremental change or practical, what we think is practical. And the youth movement, urgent systemic change, and that wasn't language there even 4 or 5 years ago. So can give everyone cause for hope. And politicians are feeling the heat a lot more when it comes to climate, and they're, again, social license to push through these devastating sort of fossil fuel projects. It doesn't exist now. It's really difficult for even in the UK. So that's where I'd say I'm optimistic rather than. I won't put it this way. I won't be up my feet applauding, giving standing ovations on Fridays. My anticipation.
Well, on a mixed note, but with cause for optimism, albeit a huge dose of cynicism and appreciating there's a lot of work to be done. I am immensely grateful. We've run slightly over time, so I do apologise, Jamie, but it's been a huge pleasure and I'm really incredibly grateful for your time. Thank you so much.
Very welcome.